Welcome back to K Chat with me, your host, Kayla Morales. We chat all things from love to business, spirituality, health and wellness, and everything in between. This is a space of growth, understanding, and meaningful connection. And I'm so excited to share this episode with you all. So let's get to chatting. Today's guest is a huge inspiration and mentor to me. She is a huge part of the reason why I continued my journey with acting. She is an applied theater practitioner, co-founder of Blind Spot Collective, an educator, and a performer. I am so excited to welcome Catherine Hanna Schrock. Hi, how's it going?
Hi, Kayla. Going well. Such a lovely introduction. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, it's all truth. I mean, thank you for doing this with me because I feel like we've never actually sat down and talked about your journey. And so I'm excited to hear it just because, I mean, again, I'm so inspired by you. So I think it'll be good.
Thank you. Yeah.
But yeah, let's jump in and let's start with where your journey with theater began.
Yeah. So, I think many of us theater people can remember theatrical indicators at a young age. And so
Yeah.
I always felt like I loved to pretend and I loved to imagine, even at a really young age. However, I actually stumbled on theater much later in my childhood. I was a senior in high school, and I was either a junior or a senior, but I remember sitting with my guidance counselor, and he said, "You have to take an extracurricular class." And he was kind of running through a list, and I was pretty depressed at the time because we had just moved for like the 14th time in my life, and we were in Michigan, and I didn't like it as a state, and so I was. But he was like, "How about this? How about this?" And then he said, "Acting," and I was like, "Okay, acting." and um, and then I remember my very first assignment. I had to do a monologue, and uh, I went up on stage and I performed it, and everybody was fully in awe. And it was the first time I felt like I had a natural skill at something, artistic, because I had never really identified that skill in myself.
Wow.
And then from there, I started doing all the school plays and experiencing the beauty of like community and ensemble, in theater, of how we all just connect, and that's how I was just hooked in to
did it like come naturally, like when you first stepped on stage and stuff? Did you feel comfortable in that space, or was it something you had to kind of work at?
It's interesting. I actually think right off the bat, I was comfortable, like I was able to push through the nerves. But as I progressed as an actor, I started developing some kinks. It's kind of like I had more anxiety sort of as time went on. But initially, I think because the stakes were low and I was kind of like, I'm probably not good at this anyway. And, and it was great. Yeah, but I always have dealt with nerves. There's my spouse in the background.
Hi, Peter.
And I even now, more than 22 years later, I still deal with some just kind of things around that. But somehow it was fairly natural, yeah. And the skills were natural to me as an imaginative person and embodying different characters, even doing big characters I really loved. Like I could have been a children's theater performer,
Yeah, that's so cool. Where did it go next from that? Did you continue in college, I assume, or maybe not?
Yeah. So when I started to do community theater when I graduated high school, and then I started to do college theater when I went to like a university. I started out in a 2-year college. I just kept acting. I kept performing, and I, not to sound sort of boastful, but I continued to excel and get like good roles, And so it was really just invigorating to feel like I got the part. I got the part. I got the part. As a person who I had fairly low self-esteem as a child. in general, and as an immigrant, I always kind of had imposter syndrome and didn't
Mhm.
feel confident in myself to find something artistic that also had a real kind of a glamour to it, you know, being on
Yeah.
stage and being a performer and having people like watch you afterwards whenever you enter the lobby after a show.
Yeah.
You know, it was just sort of surprising. And I think even more than I realized, it really boosted my self perception and my confidence. I say more than I realized because I did a lot of that reflection, kind of looking back at my life. I was like, wow, somewhere between the time I started theater, you know, and now I have like significantly become a better version of myself, a more
Mhm.
at ease version of myself in life in general. And I fully attribute that to theater. Not like, not obviously there are other factors in life, but so much of that had to do with my seeing myself, you know, be good at something. And yeah, and all the other kind of things that you experience in theater, of just connection with people and
Yeah.
boldness and using your voice and opening up your body. And you know, so much of theater is more than what it looks like even, and all of that really healed me and penetrated in my sense of being. And so
Yeah, I agree. I think like acting for me has helped me open up in ways that I didn't really expect acting to help me open up. And just like when you're, I guess when you're digging into a character and learning all of their little things, thinking about how they tick, you're thinking about so many levels of their being, I guess. And then it makes you think about yourself in the same way, you know, like you kind of can
absolutely.
dissect yourself in a different way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's cool. What's one of your favorite memories as a performer? Good
Yeah.
or bad?
Yeah, so I think that you know, the early years are such formative years, and so a favorite role was one of my first roles, my first main roles, and it was Titania in A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Mm,
Um, I loved the role. I think because of it was my first experience with Shakespeare, and so it was part of the kind of what we were talking about, is learning to use the language of Shakespeare and observing myself speaking in that way was just was a new layer and something really interesting to me. And I really love that play.
mhm.
I love, even now, I kind of feel a connection to just the concept of this other world, you know, this fairy world, this sort of spiritual space, you
Yeah.
know, that is happening at the same time as the kind of quote unquote real world. So I connected with this kind of fairyland that Titania, you know, and Oberon were part of like the mischief, the sense of playfulness, and also just this, yeah, that sort of spiritual reality of like there are two worlds, and I love that I can cross into the fairy world. You know,
Yeah.
it's just a really lovely, like imaginative space. And I also got to like so as a person also who wrestled with my hair all my life,
Mm,
especially
mhm.
growing up in predominantly like dominant culture white environments, I was embarrassed of my hair. But for that role, my theater director was like, go all in with your hair, out, like brush it out. And so I wore my hair big, and I had this like, you know, gold kind of like eye makeup, and I just felt like I felt beautiful.
Yeah,
And
that's
of
the
course
best.
I had a theater crush on Oberon, and
Yes, of course.
so there's just so much that was like glorious about that role and that
Yeah.
experience. Yeah.
Your description of the play, I actually haven't read Midsummer or seen it, but your description of it kind of describes how I feel about theater as well. It's kind of like this other like spiritual world that we get to like enter and play in and exist in, and then we kind of like go home. But
Yeah.
yeah, kind of that's just what it brought my mind to.
Yeah, I think
Um,
you're absolutely right. It is a
yeah.
mysterious place. I think the arts do that in general. They tap into this kind of mysterious place that we can pretend to sort of do and be something different.
Yeah.
But in particular, theater, obviously, just because I have a connection to it. But yeah, I fully agree with you with that
Yeah.
fairyland, otherworldly theater.
Have you seen, this is a complete side note, but have you seen Soul, that new like
I
Pixar movie?
have, yes, I have.
It kind of reminds me of when they're like all the little dream bubbles of like while they're performing and stuff. It's kind of like that.
Oh yes, no. I mean, I think it's very intuitive that the artists have the same thing that the contemplatives have. Is that
Mhm.
when you're in that artistic space, you go into. I actually call it fairy brain,
Oh
like
yeah.
when I can feel that I'm in a like a creative mode, and I've had it in in random moments too. Like I had it in the middle of watching a Broadway play because we were also creating a play at the same time,
Mhm.
and I remember I couldn't even see what I was writing, but I
Yeah.
was just like scribbling on my program ideas and like hardly paying attention because I had fairy brain and I had to just
And you
go
have to get it
all
out.
in. But
Yeah. That's
yeah, but
funny.
that trance like soul. Mhm.
Yeah, that's funny. Right before this, yesterday, I was doing something very casual and like poems just kind of pop up in my head these days, which never really happened before last year. But a whole poem came to my mind like so quickly that I couldn't write it down. And I was thinking like, how do other artists do this? And I was like, voice memos, like I should use voice memos.
Yes.
But that's a side note. Yeah, when you get fairy brain, I guess it just like flows out so fast that you kind of have to catch it when you get.
Yes. And gosh, please share that poem with me.
If I could
The
remember,
fairy
I
brain
just remember
poem.
thinking, "Oh, that's so great." And then I was like, "Oh, I want to write it, but I can't remember."
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Some
yeah.
people have like the little black book that you always keep in
Yeah.
your pocket too. Something about writing is nice, but yes, we can put notes on our phones, we can voice memo on our
Yeah.
phones. But
Yeah. So how did acting or theater evolve into activism
mhm.
and education for you?
Yeah, yeah, thank you for the question. So
Mhm.
I would say that they had always been like parallel roads, but they were never intersecting until later on. But in some ways, that kind of activism and like compassion-driven thing came first. It was more of how I saw myself kind of in the world, where I instinctually was very driven to help people at a young age. That was kind of how minimal, or like the simplest version of what that looked like is
Yeah.
that when a friend, not even a friend, when a stranger was like crying on the playground, I wanted to go over and help. And, so that matured into like, you know, the question of how we can be curious about people, pe- working with people in more healing capacities that
Mm.
are. Um, so then I thought about for a while. I thought about like medicine. I thought about social work, and so I ended up studying international development, and I studied sociology.
Mm.
And so I was on this road to like be an organizer and work in community development, and but simultaneously, I was Olivia on uh, what's it called again? 12th Night. I was like
Uh-huh.
playing these like fairyland, otherworldly acting roles. And so I kept trying to kind of escape theater because I knew I had this compassion drive, this justice drive, and I couldn't escape it. And so I actually graduated college having like avoided theater and said, I cannot not do theater. So how can I start to merge the two together? And I've always considered that an exploration, an ongoing exploration that I'm still on.
Mhm.
But essentially, once I graduated college, I got an internship at a theater company in Chicago that did kind of socially engaged theater, and I started to teach through that theater company. I actually started to teach a drama club for a local middle school, and that always just evolved, where I was at times teaching theater or teaching using theater, or I was around theater companies that were like that were talking about social justice issues and like histories of different communities and racial issues and so on. Um, and so, yeah, literally, there have just been so many chapters, so many projects, so many iterations of this like ongoing quest of how can theater help us engage society? How
Mhm.
can theater address a social justice issue? How can theater create connections between human beings? Those are some of the key questions that I just keep asking those questions,
Yeah.
and I've obviously learned some things along the way. But yeah, it's very exploratory. It's not a straightforward career path.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that inspires me so much about like the path you're on is like it just seems like an exploration all the time, which to me like is kind of what keeps I don't know the fun alive in life. Like, like I don't really want to be on a path where things are set for me forever. I'd rather always be exploring and incorporating artistic ways into my life like and that's why your story always inspires me or like just watching you inspires me because I'm like if she can make it happen like I know I can too because I just think it's yeah I just think it's cool and I think it's powerful in a way to kind of choose a path that's not so straightforward,
Yeah, it's risky. It is
Hmm.
risky, and requires a lot of like volunteer time, in a way,
Yeah.
because you have an idea and you're driven by passion, but where does this thing fit? Like I have a play idea, I have a poem, I have,
Yeah.
but where am I going to put it where I can share it with the world, let alone like make money off of it?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but it pays off. And I know, like, as our conversation goes on, I think we can talk more about some of that because I really do feel the persistence toward passion pays off,
Yeah.
even in terms of being able one day to like establish a career where you can sustain yourself.
Yeah. Persistence towards passion.
Hmm.
I like that. Can you explain what you think the power of storytelling is?
Yeah. Yeah, I like this question a lot too. I think that we have an opportunity in telling stories, essentially, and this is something that's really dear to Blind Spot, the company that Blake and I run. We have the opportunity to take a story and show it to a community that may not get the chance to know that story.
Yeah.
So and vice versa. I think there's an exchange of life experiences where that people don't often get the chance to experience, and there's something when you put it live on stage, there's something particularly undeniable about it,
Yeah.
because obviously there are books and there are movies, but to allow people to see a story that they wouldn't normally see, a life experience they wouldn't normally be exposed to, and to have it live there in the room, and even be able to look around and watch other people experiencing it. There's just a deep humanizing that happens in that.
Hmm.
um, the other thing I think, like, sort of concept that is really interesting to me in storytelling is, sometimes we, in life, we can kind of know a little bit of someone's story. We know an incident, we know a moment.
Hmm.
But one thing that there's some language I've started using, even in some of the theater of the oppressed work, or working in community, or even working in some of my like conflict resolution circles and stuff, of like, what is the story behind the story? Right, like going deeper, even with like, and you and I have done some of this work together of like looking at a character who for all purposes in this story is the enemy, is the oppressor, but
Hmm.
like, what's their story? Let's
Yeah.
focus on them and let's look behind it, that maybe they struggled somehow in their lives, maybe they didn't have the appropriate like supports and life and family connections to cultivate a sense of like self-respect, and that carries out into not respecting others, and
Yeah.
but when we can imagine the story behind the story and really like help audiences go deeper and even help audiences imagine themselves. I often ask the question, what do you think their story is? And we just hear from them, and they start saying, oh, maybe this terrible thing has happened to them too, and that's why they're putting it onto someone else, and so on, right? Inviting people to tell stories. So yeah, I think building, creating connections, exposing people to something they wouldn't normally know, and also inviting them to imagine for themselves what more might be behind this, and how can we, really develop a sense of empathy and understanding.
Yeah. Yeah, I knew you would answer it so beautifully. That's why I asked the question. I agree completely. And like, I think I obviously want my theater work to kind of support that, but also my podcast too. I always think like this is a chance, an opportunity for me to really share stories, by people who inspire me, but also who will inspire others. And I get to dig deeper into their stories. And it's just like another form of exploration that I get to be a part of. So it's so exciting. Can you explain Theater of the Oppressed so then we can get into kind of some of your pieces of work?
Yeah, sure. So real quick, kind of broadly speaking, theater of the oppressed is it has different layers, it has different categories, but generally speaking, theater of the oppressed is the idea that there's more that we can work out in community, and we can discover conflict and really untangle human nuances through the body. So there's a lot of sort of theater activities, theater games that create connection or that allow people to explore power dynamics. More specifically, the kind of theater of the oppressed that I sort of specialize in is forum theater. And forum theater is basically, it's a type of theater where it's always based on real events or a true story or a collective of stories that kind of that multiple people offer, and that one sort of scene or scenario is created based on real input from multiple stories. But over the course of a forum theater play, we observe a conflict or an oppression happening, and that ultimately not enough support is offered to the protagonist, and the oppression ultimately leads to a tragic ending for the protagonist. And that's how we leave our audiences. The play is over. We just watched our protagonist lose the things that they want, and that's it.
Yeah.
So it does the opposite of what a lot of theater and entertainment does, which is create that catharsis where you're like, and there's a happy ending.
Yeah.
The guy got the girl, and she was down and now she's up.
Yeah.
But that's very intentional. It agitates an audience to say, okay, no one's gonna solve this problem for us. We have to solve it.
Yeah.
So it's like the ultimate activist theater to say, we are the ones who we've been waiting for, that this theater company is not going to solve the problem, this playwright is not going to solve the problem, we have to. So then we turn it over to the audience and we say, this is the story, it's based on true stories. Now, what could we have done differently that might have changed this story? And then you embark on an interactive discussion and role play process in which the audience then goes back to the play, that we replay scenes within the short play, and audiences can stop when they see something that could have happened differently that the protagonist or an ally might have been able to do to change the story. And then the facilitator brings the audience member in safely, and they replace an actor and they practice a new choice. They practice saying and doing something that might have changed the story. And we spend usually up to an hour doing that process. And they get to imagine and practice sometimes we call forum theater a practice for the revolution. It's a practice
Mhm.
of like what I can do to empower myself and to support someone else. A practice for how we can get rid of sexual harassment, practicing how we can speak up to, an oppressor or an aggressor or a bully,
Yeah.
practicing how we can defend someone else. There is no right or wrong way to do it, right? Like we say,
Mhm.
take risks. There's no one answer, like, I landed on the right way to speak to an oppressor. But the exploration is really valuable, the discussion, the discovery, even the disagreements that happen in the
Mhm.
midst of a forum process is really valuable for people to just think and develop and explore.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very empowering, and it's awesome to watch, especially when we're working with children, to see how they just step into the roles, and most already have like the answers within. Like, most students are prepared and, like, I don't know, powerful when they step up to speak up and change the outcome of the story. So it's really cool to see. Do you want to describe some of the shows you've done with this method?
Yes, sure. Um, So the one that we are currently doing virtually is Safa Story. So I can start with that one. It's been on my mind. I actually taught it for the first sort of pilot version of our digital program this week. But the development process was that I worked directly with someone who had experienced racial injustice in her life, which many of us have. But I was focusing on her as my student, and she told me a story about fifth grade, when and how a new kid came to school and really broke down all of the social ties that she had to her community after she had worked really hard to just be like a normal person in her all white environment as a Black girl.
Mhm.
And so I worked with her. Her name is Sasha. I worked with her, and we put it into a forum theater model, um, and it's become an educational piece. We've seen close to 10,000 children with Safa Story is the name of the piece. Primarily fourth, fifth, and sixth. Sometimes we service third and seventh also, but it's been a school tour show. And yeah, I have seen some really remarkable things in over the course of doing this kind of work. I can share more specific examples, but maybe would you like me to share examples of some of the other models as well before I dig into specifics? Or
Um, you can dig into specifics. That's okay.
okay. Um, so some of the things that really move me when I watch Safa Story, I've been the main facilitator of Safa Story, are some of the unexpected moments,
Mhm.
like so there's a central oppressor character, as we call it in this form, a person who really bullies Safa, who is a white kid, who is not familiar with her culture and has not been around a lot of Black children. um, but multiple times I have watched other children actually raise their hand and say, I see myself in him. I see
Mm.
myself in that bully. And they haven't only been white children, they've been, Latinx children. There was one child who was a refugee from Iraq. And he answered the question. We asked him, like, why is Ryan bullying Safa? Why is he acting this way? And this refugee child said, maybe Ryan left his home, the home where he had all his friends, and so he feels really bad and he feels angry and he misses his home, and so he's taking it out on her, and
Aw.
and I was like, he's telling a refugee story,
Yeah. Aw.
like and he's explaining his pain here in front of over 100 other children who are his peers. And he's also humanizing in some way this white kid, like
Mhm.
this child is not just a horrible person and a hopeless oppressor, but like many of us can relate to that experience for different reasons of being domineering or angsty, for other reasons. And so things like that, I think those unexpected moments are really amazing. Another unexpected moment was, we were doing sophistry actually at a nearby elementary school, for fourth and fifth graders, and I swear it was the smallest fourth grader in the room, a little
Oh.
girl, who stopped the play and kind of came up a little bit shy and tight in a way, and I think I have never seen someone change the story as significantly as her.
Oh.
And we're trained to respond naturally too, to respond honestly. So we weren't just giving her freebies.
Mhm.
She spoke to Safa and she gave Safa advice as her friend, and she was very loving and caring, and she was also very assertive, and she said Ryan needs to apologize. I think we need to talk to Ryan, and so she ended up facilitating a moment of like mediating between Safa and Ryan,
Oh.
and by the end Ryan apologized to Safa because of what this child did, because
Yeah.
of her persistence and her passion and her compassion, and it's just for all purposes it's just a make-believe scenario, but being there together, they feel so invested. It all
Mhm.
feels very real, and the emotion of watching another child ultimately end up without their friends and losing everything is very real to a lot of children,
Yeah.
whether they relate to the race conversation or not. So yeah, those are
Yeah.
some powerful moments in that
I
play.
think it's like I think it's just so powerful for everyone in the room because I think as adults in the room, as the facilitators, it's like just a play, there's not, but like it's still once you're in it, it feels really powerful and it feels like we're really encouraging them to like be little activists, and stand up for everyone's rights. And I don't know,
Yeah.
it's really cool.
Yeah, and also I think the methodology is to base it on true stories. So
Hmm.
also there's an aspect in which we say this is a play. These big grown-up actors are playing fifth graders, but this is based on a true story, and you
Yeah.
can't argue with someone's true story. There's
Hmm.
That's also an important part of the method of like it comes from truth. This is real. This happened to someone, and it happens to others.
Yeah. I want to go back and ask you when you when did you start using this method, and how do you decide when you're going to write a story on someone? Is it that you met your student and then you felt something, or like I would just wonder what that process is like.
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I first learned about this in graduate school, from my sort of guru. His name is Chris Fine, in New York City. Really, really powerful at this work. So I had a really good teacher, in general, and I actually was part of a Forum Theater troupe as an actor and a joker when I was in New York. So that
Oh.
was, maybe, gosh, 12, 13 years ago, a long time ago, that I started doing this.
Mhm.
I took a break for a long time because because of what you're saying is it's sort of like where are the opportunities to make it, and then
Mhm.
where's the funding coming from, and it's also very kind of obscure type of theater. And um, so when I moved to San Diego in 2014, I started to establish myself as a forum theater person again, actually through another project, through Point Loma Nazarene University, that is now called No More, about human
Mhm.
trafficking. So I was the designer of the program, and I pitched it to them, and it was kind of a risk because I hadn't done it for a long time, but I was like, I think this would be a really great method for this educational piece.
Mhm.
And we piloted it. Kayla, you were part of that. You were one of our early actors.
Mhm.
And and then from there, I started kind of developing a name for myself of like someone who knows how to do this very rare type of work that is
Mm.
theater activism in San Diego. So I did it as a residency as part of in a high school, a local high school, and they put on their like fall play as a forum theater play. It was amazing. They did a great job, and I kept kind of honing in on my skills in that. But so in terms of like how do you identify someone, I'll say this: the ideally you're working with a community. Like the way
Mhm.
that I developed Danny's story, we developed it as Blind Spot Collective, was another piece. Was that we received funds, because
Mhm.
funding is always an issue, and the funds were directly towards servicing the LGBTQ plus community, and we decided the transgender conversation was really important. So we invited a community of transgender youth, transgender identifying youth, and other LGBTQ community members as well, to be in the room to tell stories. Like, so
Mm.
they volunteered to be a part of like an experience of theater of the oppressed games and community building and
Mm.
just like connecting with each other, and then ultimately talking about the ways in which they experienced oppression toward devising a form theater piece. And my role was simply to facilitate the games, the activities,
Mhm.
and the process of like getting us comfortable enough to tell some of these harder stories.
Yeah.
And then my role became like kind of the one who compiled it, or like wrote it, essentially the
Mm.
actual like writing of things. But it all came from true moments. With Safa, the student was Sasha. She was very eager to talk about race with me. You know, I was
Mm.
probably one of only a very few teachers of color that she had herself,
Mhm.
and we were in an acting for social justice class. And so because I knew she was passionate, I already knew she'd be up for this with me. So when I asked her, she was like, yes,
Oh,
you know.
yeah.
So it's a little bit of that kind of exploratory thing of like,
Mhm.
oh, all the circumstances are right. Let's do this, right?
Yeah.
But nowadays I try to fundraise in advance, because I think it's important to try to pay all the people involved as much as we can
How
once we
do
have a
you
funding
fundraise?
source.
Do you reach out to people in the community or?
So we are attempting now. There's a dream of creating a new forum theater piece through Blind Spot that's about consent and sexual harassment.
Mm.
And we've identified the issue because we know a lot of people are passionate about it.
Mhm.
So, but now we're sort of tucking it away, tucking it aside, and we're basically looking for funds, which means we're looking at grants that service this cause. Um, Potentially there could be, you know, donors who are passionate about this that want to fund this specifically,
I see.
or like, but I mean, it really is, for us as a company, it's mostly been about grants, looking for
Mm.
the right grant. So once we have the right grant, we'll be able to push go on this project, and we hope to, within the next year or so, to start developing it with the community.
That sounds exciting. It sounds like a powerful show. I mean, they all are. You also do a lot with verbatim, and so verbatim theater is still a little different than forum, right? Is it all part of the same method or?
It's actually not. It's verbatim theater is not a theater, is not part of theater of the oppressed.
Okay.
However, Blind Spot is interested in blending the two.
Mhm.
In fact, and I think we saw that a little bit in No More, in some of the, like, though it wasn't verbatim, but like, you know, some of the kind of intermittent dialogue moments where you
Yeah.
just show something that looks like a real person just telling their story, right?
Mhm.
But we're interested in doing that more deliberately, as like precise language coming from the interviews with victims of this issue, you know,
Mhm.
X issue. But then they would exist as sort of either components of the forum play subtly, but also as like introductory pieces, a breakout moment, a closing moment, right?
Yeah.
Where it would be interviews with people who identify with the issue specifically,
Mhm.
just to keep our audiences really thinking about what's real. But but it's minimal to how you can really integrate it. It would have to be part of a bigger kind of program around,
Mhm.
educating people on that. But yeah, verbatim is usually separate.
Mhm. I brought that up because I was thinking about a time where we went and we did interviews with refugees. And I remember thinking, like, just the interview process was so powerful and so like it just made me think about refugees in a different way. And 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 I guess not in a different way, but just understand parts of their stories that I had never really considered. And so, I don't know, it's just like the whole process. It's like obviously the show is so moving, but even just like interviewing and talking to people, which is something that we all could do. We could all, go out of our normal comfort zones and reach out and talk and hear someone else's story, but just hearing someone else's story um and experiences in another country was really like life-changing to me. And I don't know which piece that was for. It might have been for Quillily or
Yeah, it was Kulili.
yeah.
Yeah, it was Kulili.
Um, but that really, yeah, that moved me. And I didn't see the show. I never got a chance to actually see the show, but the interviews alone really changed how I thought about like 11-year-old refugees, and the things that they have been through. So I was happy to be a part of
Well,
that.
yeah, and I'll say that the main thing that's the same about them is that it's based on true stories,
Mhm.
and there's a process that comes before, right? That is like,
Yeah.
we engage community.
Hmm.
So with forum theater, you engage community. We listen, we do games, we talk, right? When you're speaking directly to the impacted community over a social issue.
Hmm.
Same thing with the interview, right? We
Yeah.
actually, you and I and Shalina showed. So we actually showed up at a soccer field where there were children
Yeah.
um, playing soccer, and we would just pull them out, right, and talk to them. But yeah, we were in the community. We were getting to know people. We were asking questions. We were also like part of their life experience, right? We
Yeah.
weren't. It wasn't just like at a desk, in an office or something. It was out in their
Yeah.
spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, I loved that. I would love to be a part of that more in the future too. That's a side note. But yeah, that was great. Um, what have you well, I guess we talked about some of your experiences. I'm interested in hearing more about you describing maybe Danny's story and even Quillily and yeah, and your experiences with those shows.
Yeah. So Danny's story is the one that, as I was mentioning, is we worked with transgender and other LGBTQ plus community members who volunteered. They were youth who volunteered, who wanted to be in community with each other and wanted to learn, or not learn, but share about their experiences. And they knew it was toward creating an educational piece for all youth,
Mhm.
um, cisgender and transgender youth, to understand some of the struggles of the transgender experience, and also to figure out how to be allies, how to
Yeah.
support transgender communities. So we spent, I believe it was either 2 or 3 like 5-hour long workshops with them, where we had dinner with them, and we spent time getting, is the noise okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
We shared a meal together, we played theater games, we got to know each other, and then we got to storytelling, and after I wrote the play based on their stories, we came together and we did a reading, and they said,
Mhm.
this feels real, this, I would change this piece, in terms of like really monitoring what felt accurate to their stories. So then I revised, and then we came back again, and they said, sounds good.
Nice, yeah.
But then we were able to pull together an ensemble, primarily people who identified in some way as LGBTQ, um, plus, and we had a joker, and the cast went out into schools in all over San Diego, primarily high schools, and put on this forum theater experience where high schoolers got the chance to observe the play, reflect on it, and figure out how they could be allies when our transgender youth was really being oppressed and affected.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of the overall picture of Danny. And it's tricky work. The more you take risks, the more
I was gonna
you,
ask, yeah.
yeah, it's challenging. Like, there were times where we felt like we were concerned that, we had some transgender people tell us this piece feels like it's more about the cisgender community than it is about us. For example, and it was in some way, primarily the audiences were cisgender audiences,
Mm-hmm.
but kind of like really navigating, making sure to elevate transgender voice and perspective.
Yeah.
I myself am cisgender, but I was the writer,
Mm-hmm.
and what kind of challenges does that pose, even just in terms of optics for the transgender community? As best as we can, we always try to defer to the community to really help us regulate what feels good,
Yeah.
and what feels like proper storytelling, feels accurate to their stories. But it's not always easy to do. And sometimes people have different opinions. And so there were I think there were some challenges for us around that. And we tried to be responsive. We made little adjustments all along the way. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say the topic too, I would imagine would be challenging for some schools. I feel like the same thing with human trafficking, like that show as well as, I don't know, some places just aren't ready for certain language and certain things, which is another challenge that you face as an artist, I guess.
That's a good point. That was another thing, was that it was a hard sell.
Mm-hmm.
The program was also a hard sell. And ultimately, I think for that reason, more than any reason, is why we have the show on rest,
Mm-hmm.
right? Normally we try to kind of keep the shows going and touring, and but because a lot of schools were not open, in particular, like parts of San Diego were less open. It was a hard sell, and so that's also disappointing. But also, like, it's unfortunately, the culture is constantly evolving, and we can kind of only do whatever they'll like let us in for.
Yeah. Give them what they're ready for, piece by piece. Yeah. I think this is my last question. What advice would you give to your younger self in regards to using theater as a part of your career?
Ooh, I like this question a lot too, Kayla. Thank you for such thoughtful questions. It was interesting thinking about this one in advance, because I really feel like there's nothing I would have done differently.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah,
Good feeling.
it really is. And so then I was trying to think about what are some of the ingredients that I would want to encourage in my younger self based on what happened. And I would say keep trusting your gut, because even when I had family members who were like, what the heck is this, like, theater for social justice thing? You can't just make up a career. I had sort of, adversaries who lack of encouragement from some of even parents. But trust your gut. Like, for me, I knew there was something. Yeah, for me, I knew there was something there, and I went with it. And sure enough, I feel like I proved them wrong.
Yeah.
The other thing I think that I did was I stayed persistent and organized. And I see that in you a lot, Kayla. You're amazing with that. But like,
thank you.
I thought a lot about, like, I was strategic without trying to be strategic. I really was just persistent and curious, and I would try things out. I took risks, and I kind of calendared things, and I pursued things, and that didn't work, and I pursued something else. I had a lot of kind of odd jobs along the way that were really just tangential to
Mhm.
really what I wanted to be doing, but they helped me get connected, or they paid the bills in the meantime. Like even
Yeah.
some of the teaching work I did was like a little bit off course, but I got to meet people. I got to sneak in a few sort of theater specific activities with a group that I worked with that, like, you know, gave me like a playground, something to try things out with,
Yeah.
you know. So um yeah, being resourceful to, and I already said taking risks. Taking risks is huge. I think being willing to um you know, there's even just as we were talking about, just the idea of like, where are the funds going to come from? And
Mhm.
but so sometimes part of my risk taking, especially in my early years, was I have an idea, I want to write something, I really believe in this, I'm just going to do it. I don't have the money, but I believe that the money will come.
Yeah.
And it did. It didn't
Mhm.
always, but it did enough, you know. And then I
Yeah.
got to put it on stage. There were a couple of really important early pieces where we just worked and worked and worked, and we were not compensated, me and my acting partner or theater making partner. And then it got sort of it got taken in, you know. It finally
Yeah.
got received. And so trust your gut, stay organized, take risks, be resourceful. Those are the pieces that I came up with.
Beautiful. I have one more just out of curiosity. What does it feel like to you when you get to see something you've worked on for so long come to life? Like what does that feel like?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, I'll say this. Sometimes it can I can be so on the inside of it all that I don't allow it to really land on me enough,
Mm,
you know, because
mhm.
like we're working, we're laboring, we're nervous, we're trying, you know, and we
Yeah.
show up at the event. And so I do want to say, like, maybe that's some advice I'll give my younger self is
Yeah.
like, be present, be in the moment, remember what's joyful.
Mhm.
And so oftentimes it's the retrospectively where I'm like,
Yeah.
that was beautiful. I go, you know, like, and I made that and people are engaging in it. And look at these brilliant actors like performing it, and audiences are watching it. Oftentimes I perform my own work too. And so
Mhm.
which is also a different kind of pleasure, like autobiographical pieces. And so to be in front of the audience doing my own work too is
Yeah.
yeah, it's joyful. It's hopeful somehow too, you know.
Yeah. Um, I think, or I imagine it would be pretty powerful to like to not only create your own work, but then create work for yourself to be included in as a performer. You know, it's just like I got myself. Like if no one else has me, I got myself.
Absolutely. Actually, I
So
am all about the autobiographical pieces. Like,
mhm.
well, and if even just, you know, we talked about the gift of storytelling, like I got, I got to start with myself, you
Yeah.
know, like, cause those pieces were my own story as an Arab American. I told a story about that. I told a story about, with my sister about her deep depression when she was living with me,
Mm,
and how we managed that together. And, you know, so the risk, if I'm asking communities to take risks, you know, in terms of being vulnerable and telling their
mm,
own stories, I have to be willing to tell my story too. And it's healing for me.
yeah.
Yeah. And I get to perform and I love performing. I don't get to do it nearly as much as I want to be. So
Yeah. And you're so good at it.
I'm
uh,
yes, I love performing.
Thank you so much for this. Anytime I talk to you, I just always feel like it's so rich and full of little nuggets that I love and I feel inspired by. I feel like I should go write something now. But thank you for sharing. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been so lovely to be with you. Thanks so much.
Of course.